Now that you have your LX or TFT boiler set up and you're ready to program it, this is the screen you're going to get when you first turn the boiler on. So we call this the home screen. On the home screen, you've got a picture of the boiler control. You would touch that to go into setup mode. You can view lead lag down bottom here. We're not going to touch on that a lot in this presentation, but basically what you can do is view the cascade of boilers if you have them set up as a cascade. A little bit confusing for new users. Over on the right-hand side, we've got the setup button here. What this setup button is for is really for display setup. So if you go into display setup, typically the only thing you're going to do for a standalone boiler in most applications is you're going to set the date and the time. So you click date and time. You can adjust the settings up or down and hit OK to save it. You can use the back button in the upper right hand corner, and that takes you back one page at a time, just like a web browser. And the other thing you can do is anytime you see the home screen or the home icon listed here, touch home and that brings you back home. To actually configure your boiler, start by touching the picture of the blue control. That control picture will change color based on the state of the boiler. So if it's red, that means the unit is locked out. If it's blue, life's good. And if it's yellow, it means there's a hold condition of some sort, which is not necessarily a problem, but it could be. So now that we're on to the summary screen, the summary screen is my favorite screen as a tech guy, because I've got all the information that I would want to know to troubleshoot the boiler. I can see what's calling for heat. So the demand is either going to be central heat, domestic hot water, lead lag, central heat outdoor if you're using an outdoor sensor. Whatever it is, I'm going to see that up there. The burner state up here is going to tell me what the burner is doing. So it's either in run state, it could be in a pre-purge mode, a post-purge, it could be igniting the burner, and I'll know what's going on based on what the burner state says. On the opposite side of the screen, I've got my firing rate and fan speed. And the reason you have two of these is the firing rate is what the boiler control wants the fan to be doing, and the fan speed is what the fan is actually doing. It does take the fan a few seconds to respond to the request that it gets from the controller, so those two will be different for a short period of time whenever there's been a change in fan speed. And on an initial startup, you may actually see this history bar down here turn yellow and go to a hold 62, fan speed not proved. And if you ever see that, what you want to watch is look at these two numbers, and as long as they're closing the gap and they're becoming more and more equal, you don't have to worry about it. What's happening is just the fan is slower to respond than what the controller wants. If you see, for example, fan speed of 0 and a firing rate of 4,000 and a hold 62, at that point maybe you've got a problem and you'd want to start to troubleshoot. Other things you're going to see on this screen, you've got inlet, outlet, stack temperature, domestic hot water, your 4 to 20 milliamp signal if that's what you're using, outdoor temperature, and flame signal. Now, this screen will change slightly. If you hook up a system sensor and you're cascading the boilers, you'll actually lose the 4 to 20 milliamp and you'll get a box that says system, and that will represent the system temperature. Now, to configure your boiler, we're going to go over a basic standalone boiler configuration today. We won't get into a tremendous amount of detail just due to time constraints, but I want to make sure that everybody can turn their boiler on, do a combustion test, and set the central heating and domestic water. So first thing you'll want to do, we'll start off from scratch again. So you're going to start on the home screen, press the picture of the boiler control, press configure. You're going to go to CH central heat configuration. The first thing the boiler is going to ask you is, where do you want me to look for a call for heat? LCI is the default. It stands for load control input, and basically that means the thermostat connection that's labeled CH1. So when the boiler sees that there's a call on CH1, it's going to do something. Another option, and you'll notice I can't select it there because I'm not logged in, the other option is to run the boiler demand off of temperature only. So let's log in. So to do that, you hit the padlock. So it's top right hand corner, touch the padlock, and oops, there we go, touch the padlock, and we get a keyboard. The password is SOLA, S-O-L-A. So let's type that in, S-O-L-A, and then we're going to hit OK. And if you look, you can see the padlock has become unlocked, so we're now logged in. If you do nothing, it'll log you out after about 10 minutes, give or take, and you just have to log back in again. So the other option here is sensor only. So the two options for your central heating demand are going to be LCI, which is your thermostat connection, or sensor only, which means basically you're telling the boiler just to run off of temperature set point. So it's going to look at the chosen sensor, either inlet, outlet, or system sensor, and it's going to maintain the boiler temperature and the demand for heat based on what that sensor feedback tells us. Most common is going to be some sort of end switch, so we'll leave it as is. You're going to scroll to the right. Here's where you're going to pick your set point. So the set point source being local means look at what the boiler control has stored in its memory. 99 times out of 100, that's what people use. That being said, if you were using 4 to 20 milliamp, this is where you would change that. And the option is to choose 4 to 20 milliamp for the set point source, meaning that you'd be telling the boiler what the set point is rather than it looking at its memory. Down below is our set point. We'll pick a generic setting here, so we'll delete this, clear it. We'll go to 180 for 180 degrees. Off hysteresis of 10 Fahrenheit. Off hysteresis is just off differential. On hysteresis of 20 Fahrenheit, so that's the temperature below the set point at which the burner will kick back on. So as programmed, with no outdoor reset functional, this boiler will maintain 180 degrees on the central heating call. It will modulate the burner down when it gets to 180, and if it gets to 180 plus 10, it's going to shut the burner off. When that water temperature drops to set point minus the on hysteresis, or the on differential, in this case 160, the burner will kick back on and the boiler will maintain temperature in between those two settings. So once we're happy with that, you can hit the back arrow. And if you see these little black arrows on the top of the screen, you can think of these as sliding the menu sideways. It means there's more to see. So the last thing you have in this menu is modulation sensor. Won't really touch on that in this presentation. It's rarely changed. So if we keep going in the same direction, we're back to where we started. We're done with this screen, so we're going to hit the back button once. We're now back on the configuration menu screen. And next thing we're going to want is our outdoor reset. So you tap outdoor reset. It is factory enabled. The maximum outdoor temperature represents, effectively, you could think of this as the warmest day of the year that you'd like to ask for heating. When it's that warmest day of the year, you want to choose a low water temperature. That's the temperature the boiler is going to send to the heating system if you're asking for heat on that warmest day that you've chosen. So if we've chosen 180 for our central heating set point, that probably means we're doing fin tube radiant or possibly fan coils or something fairly warm. And if we were to pump 80 degree water through that system, it wouldn't probably provide very much effective heat. So let's put in something a bit more reasonable for a high temperature system. So we're going to delete that, and we'll go with, say, 120. So what that means now is if it's 70 degrees or warmer outside and you're asking for heat still, then what you would get is 120 degree water in the heating system. The minimum outdoor temperature, that represents the coldest time, and that's when you would want the maximum boiler temperature being sent to the system. So in this case, when we get to 0 Fahrenheit outside, the boiler is going to be maintaining 180 Fahrenheit into the heating system. Lastly, we've got these boost settings, and I would recommend that you use these. They're quite important, and they will save you some callbacks, and they also help improve comfort in the building. The way boost works is if let's say for example, the boiler thinks it's 70 degrees outside, and it's maintaining 120 Fahrenheit, and for whatever reason, the tenant or the person in the building is still too cold, they're going to crank up their thermostat, and the call for heat is going to last for a long time. What the boiler will do is start a timer when the call for heat starts. After 10 minutes, it's going to add 5 degrees to the set point, and it's going to keep boosting every 10 minutes at 5 degrees until we get to the maximum boost off point. Now this is important. Anytime you use boost, make sure that the maximum boost off point is hotter than the central heating set point. So we had our central heating set point at 180, so we're going to clear this, and we want to go all the way up to either 185 or 190. And what you're setting there is the maximum temperature the boiler can boost up to. The reason we set that higher than our set point is we want the boiler to be able to achieve set point without modulating back. And by setting it for 190, it will not allow the burner to go over that. If it hits 190, the burner will shut down. But the boiler will attempt to avoid it by ramping itself down as it approaches 190. And that's what we want. So now we're going to keep boosting this system until we get to 190, at which point we'll shut the burner off. If the person is still asking for heat, I guess at that point maybe something else is broken, like a system circulator, and the heat's just not moving from where it is to where it needs to be. If you'd like to see what you've programmed, you go to Show Line, and this graph represents what we've just programmed. So at the top here you can see 180 degrees, and that's what this top little square represents. At 0 Fahrenheit or colder, so if we move to the left we're getting colder, we're at 180. If we're above 0 Fahrenheit, we're somewhere on this line. So let's say we were at 30 degrees. We go up to 30 degrees till we hit the green line and we scroll across, and that means we'd be maintaining, I don't know, 155 maybe. If it happened to be 50 degrees outside and we wanted to know what the temperature of the boiler would be, that's going to be about 138 or so. And of course, we've already told it that it should never get colder than 120, so you see 120 at the bottom. And the little second square correlates to 70 degrees, which we told it that's the warmest day we would expect to call for heat. And if it's 70 or above, 120 is what you should maintain, and that's what the graph shows. If you're happy with those settings, great. If you're not, just go back and adjust them. And you basically, when you adjust the high and low outdoor temperature, you're moving these squares. You're moving them up or down, left or right, and that's going to affect how the outdoor reset behaves. And this graph will give you a good idea of what you've just programmed. So we'll use the back button once, takes us back one screen, twice to take us back to the main menu, and now we've got DHW domestic hot water configuration. It's factory enabled, so you don't actually have to set anything here. It's turned on when you get it. You do have the option to turn it off, so if you're doing a startup, for example, and you don't want the tank calling, or perhaps you do want it calling, you can disable or enable the call for heat on demand by just changing that. Make sure to set it where you want it before you leave the job for the day. You can ask the owner of the company that graciously lets us play with his boilers from time to time. I accidentally left his heat off on a weekend, so that ended up with a phone call, at least for me to come in and fix it. So demand switch. This sets where the boiler is going to look for deciding whether it should fire or not. So the factory default, so we'll set it back to defaults here, is DHW S6 switch. What S6 switch means is it's looking at the S6 contact on the controller, and it's looking for an open-closed contact, so an aquastat or a tank thermostat. If it gets that contact closure, it's going to maintain 180 Fahrenheit. It'll keep making 180 as best it can until the tank aquastat stops asking for heat and opens up the contacts. So that's how a tank sensor or tank switch works. That's pretty standard. The other option, which is commonly used, is tank sensor, so we'll touch that. And the tank sensor represents a temperature sensor in the tank. Once you've enabled that, the boiler needs to know at what temperature should I turn the boiler back on, and when do you want hot water, basically. And that's what this demand on and demand off temperature tell it. This will tell the tank, so when you're on demand switch and you've got it set to sensor, the boiler is going to say, okay, you want me to make hot water when the tank gets to 135, and you want me to stop making hot water when the tank gets to 140. In order to get the tank up to that temperature, I'm going to maintain a set point of 180 degrees. So that's going to work if you were doing an indirect hot water tank. It also works if you're doing a hot water heater and you're recirculating through a storage tank. The reason being is when the tank gets to 140, the boiler is just going to shut down. So even if you leave this set point at 180 in the water heater application, it really doesn't matter, because as soon as you get to the demand off temperature, the boiler will shut off and stop making that domestic hot water. So in a boiler application, I would leave it at 180. In a tank application, I would also leave it at 180. And there's not a lot of reason you want to change that set point. The one that you may want to change is this priority override time. When the boiler gets a call, it needs to know how long you'd like to have domestic water to have priority for. And the reason being is you can imagine a situation where maybe a tank sensor breaks or the aquastat stops calling for or continuously calls for hot water, as the case may be. If it's midwinter, you run the risk that the house could freeze, so we only allow the boiler so many hours of priority for domestic. That's what this priority override time does, is it sets how long you can ask for domestic before the boiler says, oops, there's a problem here, maybe I should go back to space heating. This setting only matters if there's both calls at the same time. So if it's midsummer and nobody's asking for heat and your tank aquastat happens to break and it calls for hot water all summer long, this isn't going to matter. When it will matter is come September, when the building gets cold and they turn their thermostats up. For the first 2 hours, your tank is going to get priority. After 2 hours of thermostat demand, it's going to say, whoa, something's wrong here. I'm going to go back to space heating and satisfy that demand before I go back and finish the domestic. And that's it for domestic hot water. So we'll back out one screen. So we're back here onto the main configuration menu. The little scroll bar on the bottom here, this allows you to scroll up and down to see the different settings. So lead lag master, you can see is down bottom here. There's a whole bunch of settings that you'll probably never use, so we'll skip over most of those. One thing I would like to show everybody is this verify button. There are a couple of settings, and the water heater is going to be one, for example. So let's go down and show you that. Under high limits, you see how there's a bunch of red writing here, and it's telling me, wait a sec, are you sure you want to do what you're doing? And it's telling me outlet high limit response. So because this is a safety and we don't want just Joe homeowner changing this and making the boiler dangerous, we've encoded some additional jumps or some hoops to jump through. So if you encounter a safety data verification, and we'll generate one here, so we're going to open this, you get a big warning. Again, we're trying to remind you, are you sure you want to do what you're doing? So yes, we do, so we're going to click OK. And we're going to be stubborn and do it again, and we're going to change our boiler so that now when it hits the high limit, it's going to lock out instead of recycling. So a recycle and hold means I've hit high limit. I'm just going to wait till I cool off and keep on going. Lock out means you hit the high limit, you shut down, you're done. The reason I mention this is for water heaters, it must be set to lockout. And if it's a boiler application, it's typically set to recycle and hold. Where these go into commercial applications, you may have to change that to meet code in your area. So we'll hit OK. Now there's a little click from the control. We immediately get a lockout, and you can see there's a little bell up top to indicate there's an alarm. And we have a lockout too, waiting for safety data verification. So we'll click OK. And if we go back home, our controller is red to indicate there's a problem. And I'll show you this lockout specifically because if I just go into the lockout, and I'll go to lockouts here, and if I just clear the lockout, it clears, and then it immediately comes back. It doesn't matter how many times you clear it, it's just going to come back. And the reason being is a safety data verification requires that you as the installer meant to do what you were doing, and in order to do that, we make you jump through an extra hoop. So let's go through the extra hoop. So we'll start on the home screen, press the picture of the control. We're going to go into the configure menu, and now we're going to use this verify button. You touch verify. You do have to be logged in to do this, so make sure the padlock's unlocked. And it says select begin to start verification, so I hit begin. And it's going to ask me, outlet high limit enable dual sensor safety, and it's going to ask me, did you mean to change the setting that you just changed? I did mean to change that, so I hit OK. And now I've got a little countdown timer. If I don't do anything, the boiler will lock out again. So what we're going to do, though, is prevent that. And to prevent it, if you look at the actual SOLA controller itself, this guy here, there's a little button down below the alarm light, and I have to press that within 30 seconds. So we just pressed it, and if we zoom in again, now you can see it says verification is complete. No more verification is needed. And I can hit begin again, but it doesn't do anything because there's no more verification. So I've successfully cleared the lockout 2. So if you come across something that requiring safety data verification, that's the only time you're required to physically press the button on the control. You have to do it at that right time. So we'll back out again. So we've got our boiler set up. Next thing we're going to want to do is a combustion test. So we're going to go to Diagnostics, Diagnostic Tests. If you look here, you can see that Modulation Test is already grayed out. That means that we're on that screen to begin with. If we go to the Pump Test screen, you can see Modulation Test lights up, meaning that you can select it. Pump Test kind of does what you'd expect. It turns the pumps on and off for a few seconds, and that's it. So not particularly exciting. Doesn't get used a whole lot. Modulation Test, however, is critically important because you do want to do a combustion test on every new startup. So you go into this menu. You can select maximum modulation, minimum modulation, or some sort of custom setting, should you choose, and then you start the test. While the test is running, you can change this on the fly, and you'll notice at the bottom here, we've got a little countdown or count up timer. When this gets to 5 minutes or 300 seconds, the test will auto cancel. So when you're doing a high fire test, or a low fire for that matter, just be aware that when that gets up close to 300, if you're not finished your test, just do this real quick. Start and stop the test. Your fan RPM won't really change because you do it so fast, and it just allows the boiler to restart the test mode. So you're always going to do high fire first. You'll probably have noticed that the boiler has not fired. You have to have an active call for heat or hot water in order for the burner to want to run, and you have to be dumping heat. What I mean by that is our boiler is programmed for 180 degrees with no outdoor sensor. If it hits 180 plus the off differential of 10 degrees, it's just going to shut the burner off regardless. So the high fire is not, it's not going to work indefinitely. As soon as the boiler hits set point, it's going to kill the burner immediately. It'll stay at high fire as long as it's able to, so it's up to you to dump heat. Same thing when you go to minimum fire. It will maintain minimum fire as long as it can, and usually this is easy because you're not dumping a lot of heat, and if it's a new startup, the building's cold, so it'll probably stay at minimum fire for an hour at a time without too much difficulty. That being said, if for some reason your heating zones are tiny and you've got, a big boiler heating a towel rack, even at minimum fire, you're still going to overheat and it's just going to shut down. So make sure you're dumping heat, and if you do nothing, the test will eventually time out. If you'd like to stop the test, just hit stop, and then you exit the screen by hitting the back button. The only thing that you have to watch at all when you're in this screen is if you're running the test and you shut the boiler off by flipping the power off, or you have a power outage or something like that, whatever test mode your boiler was in, it's going to remain in that mode when it fires back up. Now that can be a good thing. It helps you exit the screen and then look at what the firing rate, look at the flame signal while the boiler's operating at low fire, for example. Where it's a bad thing is there's no real indication that you're in test mode when you boot it back up. And if you've got a boiler that just won't modulate, what you want to do is first off try and log in, enter the test mode screen here, start and stop the test, and exit. And if your boiler all of a sudden ramps up and starts to work the way you expect, then you know what happened was somebody was in test mode, shut it off, and didn't go back in to cancel the test mode when they turned it back on. So that covers the basics of your startup.